I'm Michael Barr. Thanks for watching. Morris Ranch, about halfway between Fredericksburg and Kerrville, has a unique hill country story. And in this from a place that has a lot of unique stories. If you think about the history of Gillespie County, you have Moisebach, one of history's most remarkable characters. You have Louis Jordan, Nimitz, LBJ, Hondo Crouch, Geach Cook, Luckenbach. Well, Morris Ranch is another story just like those. I came to Fredericksburg for the first time in August of 1981, and right away I heard about a place called Morris Ranch, and I assumed it was a regular cattle ranch, which it wasn't. Then I heard it was a community with a store and a school and a post office, and it was a place that raised and trained racehorses. Not quarter horses, which I expected, but thoroughbreds. And it all seemed so out of place. Well, a few weeks ago, I drove down Morris Ranch Road, and I'm looking at that countryside, and it's typical Texas hill country. It has a rugged beauty, but I'm driving down Morris Ranch Road, looking at the scenery, and I'm thinking, man, this is about as far from thoroughbred country as any place I've ever seen. I associate thoroughbreds with East Coast, blue blood, old money, the Vanderbilts, the Carnegies, the Rockefellers, an expensive hobby for the super rich. And the Texas hill country was a long way from those places. Then I remembered a day 40 years ago, driving down Morris Ranch Road for the first time, not knowing what was down there, but excited to see it. The road ran along the north side of the river. You know, I didn't see a blade of Kentucky bluegrass anywhere. I saw lots of mesquite and prickly pear and rocks. Then where Morris Ranch Road intersects Alfred Petch Road, I saw it. I had wondered what Morris Ranch might look like. Well, I can tell you what I saw that day was better than anything I could have imagined. It had a loneliness to it, a quiet beauty. But more than that was the mystery of it. I could imagine people stumbling onto this and wondering, what is this place and how the heck did this get here? Here was a ghost town, architecturally at least, far more stunning than the most famous ghost town of all, Luckenbach, Texas. It was like Luckenbach without all the characters. It was like Luckenbach that wasn't trying to be somebody. It already was somebody, proud and mysterious. I saw the store, this long abandoned but magnificent stone building, pretty good condition, just standing there silent, but obviously had a lot to say if you could make it talk. And then I saw the old drugstore, a smaller building, a little more run down, leaning a little. Just looking at it makes you want to know more about it. So I kept on going down Morris Ranch Road, another quarter mile. And on the left in the mesquites is this enormous two-story stone barn, biggest barn I ever saw. I learned later that there were 17 barns on Morris Ranch, the biggest ones with 30 stalls. And these barns, some of them anyway, had hot and cold running water. And this was in the 1890s. And the water was not for people, but for the horses. And then a little further down the road, I saw a building that looked like a castle on the Rhine. I'm convinced that architect Alfred Giles had a castle in mind when he designed Morris Ranch Schoolhouse. Maybe he had in mind a castle on the Thames, being an Englishman, but it was a castle, a hill country castle, and it was stunning. A magnificent castle on a rocky hill in the middle of the Texas hill country. So that was my introduction to Morris Ranch. And I was naturally drawn to it, and I began to wonder, how did this place, this magical place that raised thoroughbreds for the Kentucky Derby, get here so far from Churchill Downs and Belmont Park? You know, the Texas hill country seems in another universe from that world, especially the hill country of 150 years ago. It was like the Wild West back then. Well, that's what we're going to learn about today. Stories from Morris Ranch. So Morris Ranch had its beginnings before the Germans came. before there was a house in Fredericksburg or Kerrville, an American named William Bryan, a businessman, wanted to help the Texans during the Revolution in 1836. He supported the Texans, passed along information to them, kind of like a spy, even shipped goods to Texas from his mercantile house in New Orleans on credit. Well, you know, when you choose sides in war, you take a risk. If you win, you may get paid. If you lose, not much chance. Well, the war ended and Texas won, and William Bryan expected to be paid. But Texas was broke. No money in the bank. The Texas currency until 1836 was Mexican money. Well, after the Revolution, there was no Texas currency. The financial situation was a mess. Imports exceeded exports. Just existing day to day drained Texas of what wealth it had. And it wasn't just William Bryan, but hundreds of soldiers wanted money. Those soldiers fought for Texas and they expected to be paid. They'd been promised, but there was no money. So some politician or bureaucrat had a brilliant idea. Texas had no money, but it had millions of acres of public land. Why not give soldiers and creditors land instead of money? Sounded like a good idea. So that's what Texas did, eventually issuing land scrip for over 1.3 million acres of land to retire its war debt. There was a fairly elaborate system put in place. A board was set up in every county seat. Veterans would report to that board. They had a time window. And that board would verify that the person served in the war and the specifics of his service. Because if he fought in one battle, he got a certain amount of land. But the longer he fought, the more land he got, according to a formula. Once his service was verified, it was all written up. The records sent to Austin, checked again, verified again, and then a certificate was issued to that veteran entitling him to a certain amount of acres to be carved out of the public lands of western Texas. At first it was just a piece of paper, and many times the veteran simply sold it for whatever he could get for it. I think the state figured the land was worth 50 cents an acre, but a lot of land certificates sold for 20 cents an acre, some for 10 cents. Remember, this was not your fertile, level East Texas farmland. That was already taken. This was West Texas, dry, rocky, thin soil, beautiful, but much of it couldn't be farmed. And Americans hadn't really figured out yet how to use cows to turn grass into money. Richard King was learning how to do it down along Santa Gertrudis Creek, learning from the Mexicans, who learned it from the Spanish. But western Texas was a new kind of country to most Texans and Americans. They were still trying to figure it out. The English methods of land use didn't work well west of the 98th meridian, which is where the West begins, according to Walter Prescott Webb. You have to think differently to make use of that kind of land. And of course, we haven't even mentioned the Comanches. Well, anyway, these land certificates, many of them changed hands often. People bought and sold them. They were relatively easy to fake. Jim Bowie made a fortune selling fake land certificates. William C. Davis, in his book, 3 Roads to the Alamo, called Jim Bowie, quote, easily the biggest land swindler of his era. So these land certificates, real and fake, changed hands often. They were like cattlemen's checks, checks written by Charlie Goodnight, Richard King, Shanghai Pierce. People knew those cattlemen's checks were good, and they used them like money. They never cashed them, drove their accountants crazy. Now, William Bryan, the New Orleans merchant who helped Texas, presented his bill, and he was paid with a land certificate, over 23,000 acres, 35 square miles to be specific, 35 sections, a huge amount of property. So Bryan promptly sells his certificate. It changed hands probably several times, winds up belonging to the Levitt brothers, businessmen of New York. Now the Levitt brothers decide to take the next step, which is to patent their certificate, to turn that piece of paper into a specific piece of land. So they hire John Coffee Hayes. famous Texas Ranger and surveyor, to carve their empire out of the vast, unclaimed public domain in western Texas. And they choose, for some reason, a piece of property unclaimed along the Pedernales River about 70 miles straight west of the place where the Pedernales joins the Colorado. So Jack Hayes and his chain crew survey the land, plot it, describe it, put it all down on paper, and send it to the General Land Office in Austin, which is just north of the capital. The guys in the land office look it over, give it their stamp of approval, and issue a patent transferring the described property from public to private ownership. The paper description is then attached to the original land certificate. It's filed, and the process is complete. Now, the Levitts owned that land for about 20 years, and then they went bankrupt in 1858. Francis Morris of New York acquired the property. You sometimes hear that the Morris family bought it for 20 cents an acre. Well, I don't think that's really true. They paid something over $9,000 for the property, and if you divide it out, it comes to about 40 cents an acre. And so the Morris family of New York acquired 35 square miles of land along the Pedernales River. Francis Morris sold 6,400 acres to a guy named Peter Hayden and kept the rest. Francis Morris loved racehorses. By 1860, he had breeding and training facilities for thoroughbreds in New York and Maryland. His legendary filly, Ruthless, seen here, won the first Belmont Stakes in 1867. Francis Morris was into horse racing in a big way, and he saw the Texas land along the Pedernales as a place to extend his horse breeding and training operations. Well, Francis Morris is a New York guy. No way he's moving to Texas. So he gave his nephew, Charles Morris, power of attorney to run the ranch. So the Morris Ranch had this interesting administrative arrangement. One branch of the family owned the ranch, another branch of the family ran the ranch. Charles Morris was from Burr Oak, Michigan. Charles Morris's father and Francis Morris were brothers. They were Englishmen. So Charles Morris comes to Texas, and using crews of African American and Mexican workers begins clearing and fencing the ranch. Well, Francis Morris died in 1886, and as far as I know, he never came to Texas, or he never saw Morris Ranch. After Francis Morris died, his son John acquired the ranch from his father's executors. Now, John Morris was an interesting character, and he had connections in high places. His son Dave married Alice Vanderbilt, and Dave was Theodore Roosevelt's ambassador to Belgium. John Morris's wife, Cora Hennon, was from New Orleans. Her family was heavily invested in the Louisiana lottery. Well, John Morris, through his own money, which was considerable, and his marriage, became the majority owner of the Louisiana lottery. He was heavily involved in horse racing. People called him the Lottery King. When he died, his wealth was estimated at $30 million, which was a ton of money in those days. John is the one who really built Morris Ranch. Beginning in the late 1880s, he invested $500,000, perhaps up to $1 million in the ranch. He built a mile racetrack with a viewing stand. He built the store, the drugstore, a cotton gin, a roller mill. He built enormous two-story barns with hot and cold running water. Some of the barns had 30 stalls. Morris Ranch would hire young guys, 12 to 13 years old, as jockeys. They were small, which jockeys had to be. This slide is of a young Max Hirsch, famous trainer who got his start as a jockey and a groom at Morris Ranch. We'll have more about him later. The jockeys lived in the jockey house, up to 20 of them at a time. They had a kitchen, a cook, a teacher, all the comforts of home. By the 1890s, Morris Ranch was a big operation, well managed. Charles Morris moved his brothers and sisters down from Burr Oak, Michigan, to run different parts of the ranch. Each sibling had a specific role. Libby ran the hotel and the boarding house. Ellen was postmaster. Clayton and Fred took charge of the mares and foals. Gilbert handled the buildings and facilities. George managed the weanlings, the jacks, and the cattle. George Morris, as you can tell from his picture, was not your typical Texas cowboy. But don't let appearances fool you. His brother Albert Morris took care of the colts and spent a part of each year in England overseeing the Morris racing operations there and in Germany. By 1892, Morris Ranch was a thriving community with a store, a drugstore, a cotton gin, a roller mill, and a post office. Lots of families around. It had a school, but it needed a bigger one. And to build it, the Morris family hired the most famous architect in this part of Texas, Alfred Giles. Giles designed courthouses and public buildings in Texas and northern Mexico, homes in the King William District in San Antonio, buildings in Comfort and Kerrville. He designed the facade of the Shriner Mansion on Earl Garrett Street in Kerrville. In Fredericksburg, he designed the old courthouse, now the Pioneer Memorial Library. He designed the fortress-looking Bank of Fredericksburg building on Main Street. He designed the Bierswell House on the corner of North Bowie and Austin. He was an Englishman with an interesting character. He came to Texas for his health, but he fell in love with the Texas hill country. He tried to go back to England several times, but couldn't stay away, always came back. He bought a ranch north of Comfort called Hillingdon on the old San Antonio Road, named after his birthplace in England, and it's still in the family. The gate to Hillingdon Ranch is on Alfred Giles Road, just off the old San Antonio Highway. In 1893, Alfred Giles designed and built the Morris Ranch Schoolhouse. Very sturdy, distinguished looking, heavy stone walls, Romanesque. Nothing at all like the typical wooden frame schoolhouses of the late 19th century. This place was built to be special, and it was, and it still is. And it was built to last, and it's still there. So Morris Ranch became this community. Its purpose was to breed and train thoroughbreds. The perimeter of the ranch was fenced in barbed wire, but the fields that kept the horses were fenced with smooth plank, often two-sided, expensive but necessary. You didn't want your valuable racehorses getting scratched and possibly getting screwworm. The thoroughbreds were born there. The young ones trained there. At some point, they got their first horseshoes. Then the fastest and the most promising one-year-olds, they would walk them to Kerrville, about 15 miles away, and load them onto special padded railroad cars to go back east to New York to finish their training. They sold the rest. Morris Ranch gave employment to 50, maybe 60 local people or more besides the Morrises. And the ranch was this really interesting place. It was very diverse. A number of different cultures mixed at the ranch. Remember, Francis Morris and his brother William were Englishmen, born in Surrey, southwest of London. So Morris Ranch was a little bit of England in the German hill country. It was a window to the world. Mrs. Albert Morris organized a Shakespeare club. She put on plays at the schoolhouse. The English miller, R.B. Everett, rode the 4th of July parade dressed as Uncle Sam. African Americans worked at Morris Ranch, Hispanics as well. All these different cultures working, mixing, influencing each other, learning from each other. It was a situation that you just didn't see very often. Supplies for the store came from Kerrville, about 15 miles away. Most of them through Shriner's store on Water Street. Took a day and a half to get to Kerrville by horse-drawn wagon, and another day and a half to get back. 2 days with a big load. And ad in the 1899 Gillespie County Fair catalog read, Morris Ranch Store, Charles Morris, proprietor, dealer in general merchandise, dry goods, boots, shoes, hats, notions, hardware, tinware, crockery, family, and fancy groceries. About 1890, John Morris is in Fredericksburg for the Gillespie County Fair. They held the horse races that year on Main Street. The race started at one corner of Market Plots where Adams Street is, and the finish line was the other end of Market Plots at Crockett Street in front of the Buckhorn Saloon, seen here, which is now Security State Bank. John Morris of Morris Ranch saw this 10-year-old kid riding that day and hired him as a jockey and a groom and brought him to Morris Ranch. Max Hirsch was his name, from Fredericksburg. His brother Henry, later in life, was a longtime Gillespie County judge. At the age of 12, Max took a train from Kerrville to the East Coast with a dozen Morris Ranch horses, and he worked there as a jockey. But by age 17, he was too big to be a jockey, so he became a trainer, and he became a legend. His horses won the Belmont Stakes 4 times, the Kentucky Derby 3 times, and the Preakness twice. His most famous horse, Assault, owned by the King Ranch, won the Triple Crown in 1946, which is kind of like throwing a perfect game in the World Series. My favorite story about Max Hirsch is when he had a visit from Arnold Rothstein. If you've ever seen the movie 8 Men Out, you know that Arnold Rothstein was the famous mobster who fixed the 1919 World Series. Well, Max had a horse running at Aqueduct in 1921. Rothstein was there, and he made a special trip to the stables to ask Max if he should bet on Max's horse that day, even though that horse had never won a race. Well, Max looked him square in the eye and said, absolutely, he's going to win today. Well, Rothstein took his word for it, laid down a huge bet, and won $770,000. Max Hirsch trained horses for the actress Jane Greer, the queen of film noir. He trained horses for the Vanderbilts, the Klebergs of the King Ranch. The great jockey Eddie Arcaro rode many of Max Hirsch's horses. Max Hirsch's importance to the sport is hard to understate, and it all began on Morris Ranch. The other famous horse trainer from Fredericksburg, often mentioned with Max Hirsch, is Willie Moulter. Willie Moulter was too young to be a part of Morris Ranch, but he was inspired by it, and by Max Hirsch. Willie Moulter trained horses for Louis B. Mayer and Betty Grable. Determined, a horse trained by Willie Moulter, won the Kentucky Derby in 1954. 3 times in the 1950s, his horses won $1 million. So Fredericksburg, this little town in the Texas Hill Country, has the unique distinction of being the home of 2 men in the National Racing Museum and Hall of Fame in Saratoga Springs, New York, Max Hirsch and Willie Moulter. And it's likely that these 2 horse racing giants would not have gotten into the business if it not for Morris Ranch. Some really interesting people visited Morris Ranch, particularly in the 1890s. Politicians, senators, governors from all over, at least one Caribbean dictator. Probably the most interesting guy to visit Morris Ranch was Richard Croker, Boss Croker, an Irish-American political boss, head of Tammany Hall, the Irish mob. He ran New York, and he loved racehorses. He spent a number of days at Morris Ranch in the 1890s. Now, when these guys traveled to Morris Ranch, they stayed a while. It took weeks of hard traveling just to get there. So you didn't just spend the night, look at a few horses, and then head back home. You spent time there. A trip to Morris Ranch, including travel time, was 6 to 8 weeks out of your calendar year. Now, for a huge investment, Morris Ranch had a short life. It really got cranking with its breeding and training program around 1890, but by 1905, just 15 years later, it was all over, thanks to a strong anti-gambling reform movement. There was a feeling in the United States that gambling was like drinking. It had gotten out of control. People began to realize that betting could become an addiction like alcohol, and prohibition against gambling grew right along with prohibition against drinking. And so reformed politicians passed laws against gambling. And without gambling, horse racing is just, well, watching horses race against each other, which is exciting, but without the gambling, not quite the same. So these anti-gambling laws took effect. A lot of racetracks went under. Starting around 1902, the Morris family saw the handwriting on the wall. The family sold its horses and leased its property for traditional farming and ranching. Then in the 1920s, the Morris family decided to sell out. By 1931, the ranch had been cut into 72 farms and ranches, and all but just a few acres had been sold. The roller mill went out of business after World War I. The cotton gin went out of business after the boll weevil destroyed the cotton crop. The post office closed in 1954, and the store soon after that. The school district consolidated with Fredericksburg in 1962. Morris Ranch remained quiet for a while, and then some high drama. In 1976, a movie company shot part of a film called Pony Express Rider at the Falls on the Pedernales, a beautiful spot there on Morris Ranch. The film starred Maureen McCormick, Buck Taylor, Ken Curtis, Joan Caulfield, Slim Pickens, Dub Taylor, and Jack Elam. Cartoonist Ace Reed from Kerrville had a part in the movie. Well, it got terrible reviews. Rotten Tomatoes called it a poorly conceived family revenge western. And that was the nicest comment. About the same time, a young man from Austin rented the Morris Ranch schoolhouse and property from Fredericksburg ISD and started a winery called Haversack Winery. The owner was a young UT marketing major, and he was very good. And this winery was a huge deal. It attracted a lot of publicity. At the time, there was only one other registered winery in Texas, the Valverde Winery in Del Rio, which dated to 1882. The Haversack Winery at Morris Ranch soon began attracting nationwide attention. Lady Bird Johnson came out and planted the ceremonial first grapevine in the vineyard. Then in the fall of 1975, Haversack Wine held the first wine festival in Texas. It was legendary. Adults paid $5 to get in, and for that $5, they got a glass and all the wine they could drink. There was a 2,100-pound wheel of cheddar cheese for snacks. Pails, old-time band played. Hundreds of people came to the wild party. Many of them drank way too much. The next day, there were still cars parked along Morris Ranch Road. No one knew where the owners were or how they got home. The famous Haversack Wine Festival was a high point in more ways than one, and it brought a lot of attention to the area. Haversack Winery had definitely tapped into something, but it wasn't long until things began to unravel. The owner ran out of money, then ran out of credit. His name began appearing in newspapers in Austin and Houston, and not in a good way. He was being sued for not paying his bills. The owner and his wife had been the toast of the town. Suddenly they disappeared. An article in the Fredericksburg Standard brought the news that Fredericksburg ISD had terminated its lease agreement on the Morris Ranch schoolhouse. The renters hadn't paid the rent in months. And so the short, wild ride at Haversack Winery ended. But Fredericksburg, a little embarrassed, took it all in stride. After a time of denial, then shock, and finally acceptance, Fredericksburg and Gillespie County chalked up the incident to a learning experience, took a deep breath, and moved on. Oh well, at least everyone had some fun. And in a strange way, the shenanigans at Haversack Winery and all the publicity, good and bad, they created, put a spotlight on Gillespie County and helped awaken a sleeping giant. The wine business, after all, is a romantic adventure. It attracts dreamers, poets, pirates, and risk-takers. Within a few years, the Gillespie County wine business was growing faster than the national debt. In 1977, Frances Hurd Billups and her husband, Brigadier General James Billups, bought the Morris Ranch Schoolhouse and 9 acres of property. The current owner is her grandson, John Lucas Mannix. My hope for this presentation is that the next time you drive down Morris Ranch Road, if it's the first time or if you do it every day, and you see those wonderful old ghostly buildings, that the experience will be a little richer for you. For me, the fascination with Morris Ranch is as strong today as it was the first time I saw it over 40 years ago. It inspires and it mystifies.